Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into candlelit halls and shadowed chambers, where history speaks in whispers rather than shouts. You're not wandering through bloody battlefields or roaring taverns this time. You're treading across stone floors polished by centuries of secrecy. The flicker of torchlight casts long shadows, and in those shadows, you'll stumble across stories the official scrolls tried to erase. Stories of kings who ruled with crowns upon their heads, but hearts caught in forbidden attachments. And if you think you'll come out of this unscathed, let me warn you, you probably won't survive this one. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and the local time. I love knowing who's out there listening in the stillness of the night. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander into the throne room of England's past, but instead of the grand coronation scenes or roaring councils you expect, there's a hushed undertone. Courtiers exchange glances too quickly. Chroniclers sharpen their quills with mischief in their eyes, and whispers flow through corridors like smoke. You hear it in fragments. The king's favorite, too much affection, unnatural closeness. These words hover in the air, not shouted in public proclamations, but passed along as carefully as a candle flame in a drafty hall. There's a strange comfort in realizing that behind the steel armor and royal decrees, these men, these kings, were human. And not just human, but tender, vulnerable, aching for connections that didn't always match the image of masculine power that their crowns demanded. Imagine leaning closer to a velvet curtain, hearing a monarch laugh too loudly with a companion, or catching the softest touch exchanged at a feast. You're there, unseen, a ghostly observer of love, stitched quietly into the fabric of power. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval and early modern England kept records obsessively: coronations, land transfers, marriages, wars, treaties. Yet curiously, some of the most vivid details about personal lives come not from official documents, but from gossip, poetry, and strange little marginal notes made by monks in cold scriptoria. And it's in these scraps of evidence that the whispers of affection survive, sometimes lovingly, sometimes mockingly, but always persistent. And here's your quirky detail of the night. At more than one royal feast, chroniclers recorded kings sitting uncomfortably close to their favorites, so close that nobles at the table muttered disapproval, while others glanced away, embarrassed. Imagine a scene where a king lifts a goblet, not just to toast his queen, but to quietly acknowledge the man seated just beside him, fingers brushing beneath the tablecloth. Scholars still argue whether these whispers were slander meant to destabilize crowns or honest glimpses into hidden lives. Was it truth or convenient rumor to fuel rebellion? That's the tension you wander through now. Every shadow could be fact. Every smile could be fiction. And yet, the stories persist because people remembered them, repeated them, and embedded them in the legend of monarchy. As you drift deeper into this chamber of secrets, you realize how carefully guarded appearances were. A single rumor could topple alliances, ruin treaties, or weaken a monarch's image. But the human heart rarely listens to politics. Affection blooms in unexpected places, in the jousting field, in a royal chamber after councils end. In the simple act of exchanging gifts, more intimate than they should be. You trace these threads in the air like invisible lines connecting kings to their favorites. Your footsteps echo through empty passages, and you pause by a tapestry, its golden threads showing noble hunts and saintly deeds. Yet you suspect the truth was never stitched into the cloth. The truth, instead, lingers in the glances between figures, in gestures quickly erased, in bonds that dared not show themselves in public light. This is the realm you've entered tonight, a throne room of secrets, where history doesn't roar, it whispers. You step softly from the throne room into a long corridor lined with portraits, faces of kings stretching back through the centuries, each one painted to project authority, majesty, and divine right. But as you tilt your head, as if the candlelight plays tricks on your eyes, you sense something more. A subtle softness in the gaze, a slight curl of the lips. A hidden story, brushed into the paint by artists who knew but dared not say. You realize you're walking through a gallery of men who wore crowns but lived complicated, layered lives that no oil paint could fully capture. You stop before one portrait, its eyes following you down the hall. Whispers gather again, not from the courtiers this time, but from time itself. Edward II, his name slips into your ears like a sigh. This is where the stories sharpen. Official records describe his reign as turbulent, marked by baronial rebellions and humiliations at the hands of his enemies. But those who whispered in shadowed corners didn't speak of parliaments or treaties. They spoke of Piers Gaveston. You feel yourself leaning closer as if you might overhear Edward's laughter. He was known to call Gaveston his brother in public, but the language of letters, the depth of his affection, carried more weight than sibling warmth. Imagine the scandal of a king favoring not just one courtier above all others, but showering him with gifts, titles, and unshakable loyalty. Even as nobles fumed and spat into their wine cups, you can almost hear the grinding of teeth, the muttered curses, as Edward elevated Gaveston beyond what was politically tolerable. A mainstream historical fact is that Edward II married Isabella of France, famously called the She-Wolf of France. Their union was supposed to cement peace between two powerful kingdoms. Yet, despite Isabella's political importance, Edward's heart and attention seemed tied elsewhere. Even chronicles critical of Edward couldn't resist noting how inseparable he and Gaveston appeared, how the king's generosity toward him exceeded all bounds. Now your quirky detail of the night. Edward delighted in pageantry, but he sometimes wore outfits considered effeminate by the hard-nosed nobles of his time. Bright silks, rich patterns, and elaborate jewelry, a flamboyance that only fueled resentment when displayed alongside his favorite. Imagine Gaveston striding beside him, equally adorned, and you sense why the whispers swirled like a storm waiting to break. Scholars still argue whether Edward and Gaveston's relationship was romantic, platonic, or simply exaggerated slander weaponized by barons who loathed the king's favoritism. But when you picture the endless banquets, the jousts, the moments where Edward ignored his nobles' pleas while he lavished yet another estate upon Gaveston, you feel the pulse of something deeper than politics. You wander further into the gallery and see how their story ends, not in quiet companionship, but in blood and betrayal. Gaveston, captured by enraged barons, was executed brutally, and Edward's grief was said to be profound, his vengeance slow but inevitable. Imagine the lonely figure of a king pacing through torchlit halls, the echo of Gaveston's laughter gone, the weight of a crown suddenly heavier than ever. The portrait seems to shimmer as you step away, and the whispers shift again, guiding you toward another figure. This time, it's James I, centuries later, remembered as the monarch who united the English and Scottish crowns. Yet, behind the polished speeches and theological writings, you hear whispers of George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, James's Steenie, as he called him, with fond intimacy. The king who wrote of divine right and royal authority also wrote tender letters laced with affection that no historian can deny. And so you see the pattern. From Edward II to James I and beyond, the chronicles of England carry not just wars, marriages, and laws, but quiet stories of men who found closeness where tradition said they should not. You trail your fingers along the painted frames, wondering which other portraits are hiding truths carefully tucked beneath their gilded edges. The corridor is long, the whispers insistent, and your journey has only just begun. The kings are waiting, their secrets lingering like candle smoke, daring you to keep listening. You drift deeper into the gallery, your fingertips brushing the cool air as though the stones themselves carry memory. Another set of eyes catches yours, soft, almost weary, yet with a flicker of wit. Richard the Lionheart, the Crusader King, the warrior whose name still rings with valor, but whose personal life has always stirred whispers in the shadows. You pause before his painted likeness, all armor and solemn nobility, and you feel the weight of contradiction pressing through the centuries. Chronicles praise him for his courage at Acre, for standing tall in battles against Saladin, for being the king who embodied the chivalric ideal. Yet, when you lean closer, you hear the subtler stories, the late-night rumors that followed him not on the battlefield, but in the tent. A mainstream historical fact: Richard married Berengaria of Navarre. Yet their union was curious, politically convenient, but strangely cold. She was present for the coronation, for the ceremonies that mattered to image, but she barely featured in his life afterward. Unlike other medieval kings, Richard fathered no children, no legitimate heirs. Chroniclers noted this absence, scribbling uneasily in margins as though unsure whether to attribute it to piety, sterility, or something left unsaid. And here comes your quirky detail. Richard once shared a bed with Philip II of France. No, not in the sly gossip of a tavern, but recorded openly in chronicles. Of course, bed sharing among men wasn't automatically scandalous in the medieval world. It could symbolize alliance, friendship, even brotherhood. Yet the tone, the frequency, and the delight some chroniclers took in repeating this fact suggest more than simple camaraderie. You can almost picture it. Two kings, enemies one moment, allies the next, reclining on embroidered pillows in the dim candlelight of a French chamber. Their pact sealed, not just with oaths, but with closeness that scribes didn't dare spell out too boldly. Scholars still argue whether Richard's relationships were driven by affection, strategy, or both. Was he a calculating monarch who knew the power of intimacy in politics? Or was he a man whose personal inclinations ran counter to the expectations of heirs and dynasties? Either way, the debate has never fully dimmed, much like the candle that flickers beside his portrait. You wander a step further, and the whispers turn sharper, darker. They remind you that Richard spent little time ruling England. Barely 6 months of his 10-year reign were spent on English soil. He preferred crusades, wars, and foreign campaigns, leaving the kingdom in the hands of others. Yet the court gossip never quieted, even from afar. Imagine a castle hall where courtiers snicker as they hear tales of their absent king feasting with men he favored, while his queen withers in obscurity. And if you listen closely, you hear the echoes of his downfall. Captured on his way back from the crusade, imprisoned in Germany. Ransomed at a cost so heavy it strained England's coffers. But even in captivity, some accounts describe him as receiving comfort from loyal companions, men whose devotion seemed as personal as it was political. You tilt your head, and the portrait shifts again. The Lionheart no longer stares at you as a crusader in shining armor, but as a man who lived a life of contradictions, hailed as the embodiment of knightly virtue, yet bound to whispers that outlived him. You almost want to ask him outright. Were the rumors true, or were they weapons crafted by enemies? But his painted lips remain closed, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond you across centuries. As you move down the gallery, you realize that each king holds a similar contradiction. an image carved by propaganda, and a shadowy truth that dances just out of reach. Richard's story blends with Edward's and James's. This time, the whispers call the name Edward II, a king often remembered not for his governance, but for the scandalous devotion he held toward a man who should never have stood so close to power, Piers Gaveston. You can almost hear the sneers of medieval barons as you picture the scene. Edward, newly crowned, not rushing to fortify his kingdom, not dazzling the lords with military strength, but elevating Gaveston, a handsome Gascon knight, above all others. He gave him jewels, titles, even lands, showering him with gifts that caused noble blood to boil with resentment. Imagine it, your king placing an earring of sapphires into his companion's hand, a grin curling on lips that knew scandal would follow. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Edward II's favoritism toward Gaveston was so intense that chroniclers openly recorded the king's obsession. When Edward married Isabella of France, the she-wolf, whose reputation still chills, he demanded Gaveston accompany them. At the coronation itself, Edward reportedly gave more attention to Gaveston than to his new bride, sparking outrage in the French court and setting the stage for political disaster. Now for the quirky detail. Gaveston wasn't merely a courtier. He had a biting wit. Chronicles suggest he mocked the great lords with nicknames, calling one Burst Belly and another the Cuckold's Bird. It wasn't just Edward's affection that rankled. It was Gaveston's audacity, his ability to humiliate the most powerful men in England with a smirk and a jest. You can almost hear the chamber echoing with laughter, Edward's voice joining Gaveston's, while the barons seethed in silence. Scholars still argue whether their relationship was physical in the modern sense, or whether it was a profound bond of loyalty and affection. But the word love lingers in the records, a dangerous word when written in parchment meant to preserve the grandeur of kings. The king loved him beyond measure. One chronicler confessed, almost reluctantly, as though writing the truth while trying to muffle it with ink. You feel the mood shift, because Edward's story does not end in laughter. Gaveston was exiled multiple times, recalled again and again by Edward, the king defying his counsel as though no law could separate them. Each recall sparked another wave of fury, until finally, Gaveston was captured by barons and brutally executed. You can almost see Edward's despair, the way he supposedly mourned Gaveston like a widower rather than a monarch, retreating into grief even as his kingdom slid toward rebellion. And here lies the darker whisper. Edward's fixation did not end with Gaveston. Later, another man, Hugh Despenser, filled the void, again drawing the king's affection, and again fueling noble rage. But unlike Gaveston, the Despensers were cruel, their greed tearing at the fabric of the realm, leading to civil war and rebellion. Imagine the flicker of torches outside the Tower of London, the mutter of soldiers who whispered about their king's unnatural affections, their voices carrying the edge of contempt. Picture Isabella, scorned and dangerous, turning against her husband with a lover of her own, Roger Mortimer, raising rebellion against the crown itself. The whispers grow colder as they carry you forward. Edward dethroned, imprisoned, abandoned by the very men he trusted. And then the most chilling rumor of all, his death. Officially, Edward died in Berkeley Castle, quietly and out of sight. But the tale that spread was darker. A red-hot poker, used in unspeakable ways, meant both as execution and humiliation, to mark him forever as a man undone by his desires. Scholars still argue whether this gruesome detail was propaganda, a cruel myth meant to taint his memory, or whether it held a sliver of truth too dreadful to ignore. You stand there, shivering as though the chill of Berkeley's dungeon brushes your skin, the whispers heavy around you. Edward's portrait seems to sag under the weight of shame and sorrow, but also defiance, as if to say that even centuries of rumor cannot erase the fact that he loved deeply, recklessly, perhaps too much for the crown he wore. And as you step away, the whispers promise more, that Edward was not the only one. Kings came and went, but the secrets of their hearts linger still, like embers under ash, ready to yet tonight. The whispers don't concern the poet's pens or the conspirator's barrels. They speak of the king's heart, drawn irresistibly toward his favorites. You pause and lean closer. The whispers laugh, sly and knowing, as if to say, James never hid it well. He was a man who wore his affections openly, sometimes scandalously. His beloveds were no ordinary courtiers. They were the glittering George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, and before him, Esme Stuart, a dashing cousin who captivated James when he was still a boy king in Scotland. Here's your mainstream historical fact. James showered Villiers with titles at dizzying speed. Within a few short years, Villiers rose from a minor gentleman to the highest ranks of nobility. Viscount, Earl, Marquis, Duke. Every elevation came with jewels, lands, and honors, all delivered with James's fond declarations of love. Contemporary accounts survive, where James wrote, quite plainly, calling Villiers his sweet child and wife. Words that caused eyebrows to arch and quills to scratch furious complaints. But it's the quirky detail that really lingers. One letter from James to Villiers pleads that he would not die without kissing him. Imagine that, royal parchment, sealed with wax, carrying not orders of war, but lovesick pleas, the words of a monarch who had an empire, yet longed simply for his companion's lips. You picture Villiers, smirking, the letter tucked in his doublet, his eyes glancing at the court around him, knowing every gaze was filled with jealousy and disgust. Scholars still argue whether James's attachments were romantic in the fullest sense or the flamboyant language of male friendship common in that era. Yet the evidence sits stubbornly in archives, too tender, too urgent, too frequent to be dismissed. The affection was more than formality. It burned with intimacy that even time's dust cannot obscure. Now picture the grand halls of Whitehall Palace, velvet curtains drawn against the cold. James sits with Villiers at his side, hand brushing hand beneath the table, while ministers drone about matters of state. The whispers swirl. You sense courtiers grinding their teeth as Villiers whispers in the king's ear, shaping policy, deciding favors, perhaps even steering wars. Was it love, or was it manipulation? The debate echoes across centuries, unresolved, unresolvable. The whispers pull you to an earlier time, before Villiers, when James was still a boy in Scotland, drawn to the elegant Esme Stuart. Esme was older, charming, Catholic, a dangerous trifecta for a Protestant boy king, surrounded by hostile lords. Imagine James gazing at Esme, as though the man were sunlight itself. Even as the nobles muttered of corruption, witchcraft, and French vices, the Scottish lords forced Esme into exile. Yet James's letters reveal his devastation, a youth torn from his first infatuation before the bloom had faded. You notice the court around him, restless, suspicious, muttering about sodomy, about sin. But James never truly stopped. Again and again, he chose favorites who stirred both his affections and his politics. His reign became a theater of intimacy, where the love between a king and his companion could tip the balance of power. And here comes the oddest irony. James also published tracts on morality and religion, speaking sternly of sin and godliness, while in his chambers, he doted on Villiers with kisses and caresses. Imagine the contradictions. A king who hunted witches for supposed unnatural acts, yet wrote openly of his longing for a man's embrace. The whispers trail you further, toward the later years of James's reign, when his health waned and Villiers stood beside his sickbed. Picture the candlelit chamber, James clutching Villiers' hand, the once mighty king whispering endearments, even as death pressed close. In that dim light, love and monarchy blurred, leaving courtiers scandalized and history perplexed. Scholars still argue whether Villiers returned the king's affection with sincerity or calculation. Was he a loyal partner or a ruthless opportunist? The truth lies somewhere in shadow, hidden between sighs and signatures. But the letters remain, the gifts remain, the intimacy lingers on every page, proof that James's heart was as reckless as Edward's, just dressed in silk instead of iron. And as you step back from James's portrait, the whispers soften. You hear the echo of his plea, "I would not die without kissing you." It's less a royal decree than a human cry, fragile and intimate, reaching across centuries to brush your ear tonight. You drift into another corridor of candlelit whispers, and now they beckon you with the scent of intrigue, powder, and blood. The name they murmur? Richard the Lionheart. A warrior king, a crusader, a lion of Europe. Yet beneath the iron mail and the gleam of his sword, the whispers hum with something softer, stranger, and far more human. You picture Richard not on the battlefield, but in the gilded chambers of his youth, where chronicles hint at a bond with King Philip II of France. The mainstream fact stands stark. Richard and Philip spent so much time together during their alliance that they shared not only counsels and strategies, but also a bed. Chroniclers like Roger of Hoveden noted, perhaps scandalized, that they ate at the same table and from the same dish, and at night the bed did not separate them. For the medieval imagination, this intimacy was unmistakably suspicious, even if cloaked in the language of diplomacy. But the odd detail emerges from the way chroniclers described them as inseparable. Imagine two kings, not just allies, but entwined so closely that courtiers whispered of sin, priests muttered of scandal, and enemies sharpened their quills with accusations. You can almost see the two monarchs reclining on embroidered pillows, laughing over goblets of wine, plotting the crusade, fingers brushing as the maps spread between them. The scholarly debate grows thick here. Scholars still argue whether this shared bed signified affection in the carnal sense, or whether it was merely the custom of medieval hospitality, where men of high status sometimes shared beds to demonstrate trust. Yet the persistent whispers, the tone of the chroniclers, and the fury of Richard's enemies suggest that their companionship carried more weight than mere politeness. You step into the shadow of Richard's crusade, the holy wars drenched in both piety and blood. You see him in shining armor, his banner of 3 golden lions whipping in the desert wind. He rides hard against Saladin's forces, ferocious, tireless, a king who won the admiration even of his enemies. Yet in the tents at night, with blood still drying on his sword, the whispers imply another battlefield altogether. His heart, wrestling with the memory of Philip, the alliance soured, the affection lost in politics. And here's the quirky twist. While Richard's sexuality remains debated, his marriage to Berengaria of Navarre left behind no children, no heirs. Some chroniclers even claimed that she never set foot in England as his queen. The bed of matrimony remained as cold as the marble tombs that would later hold her likeness. Instead, Richard lavished more energy on his military campaigns and his bonds with male companions, leaving history to puzzle over his true desires. Picture the return from crusade, when Richard was captured and held ransom by Duke Leopold of Austria. Alone in the stone-cold dungeon, you imagine his thoughts drifting back not to his queen, but to the warmth of the friendship and perhaps love he once shared with Philip. The irony of a lion in chains, longing not just for freedom, but for the embrace of someone who now stood as a rival, gnaws at the air around you. The whispers now carry you to his final days. Richard, ever the warrior, fell not in grand battle, but to a humble crossbow bolt during a siege in France. As he lay dying, he named no heir of his body, leaving behind a kingdom but no lineage of his own blood. Was it fate's punishment for a heart that never followed the script of dynastic duty? Or was it simply the randomness of war? Scholars still argue whether his heart was more given to men than to women. But they cannot erase the fact that his legacy was one of bravery entwined with intimacy that dared to defy the neat lines of heteronormative chronicles. Now you sense the odd smirk of history itself. Imagine monks copying manuscripts, scratching their quills, wondering whether to include those scandalous lines about Richard and Philip, knowing that even centuries later, the words would scandalize. And still they copied them, perhaps chuckling, perhaps shaking their heads, leaving the clues for you to uncover tonight. The whispers die down, but not before they remind you. The lion's roar was heard on battlefields across Europe and the Middle East. But in the privacy of silk and candlelight, another sound lingered, the laughter of two kings who once shared more than just strategy. You step deeper into the long hall of flickering torches, and this time the whispers don't roar. They hiss. They murmur the name of Edward II, the king whose reign was tangled in disaster, rebellion, and rumors that burned hotter than any battlefield. You lean closer, and suddenly you're walking through the echo of medieval London, cobblestones beneath your feet, banners hanging limp in the damp English air. Edward II's life unfolds in scandalous hues. The mainstream fact is clear. His reign was one of political instability, marked by military humiliation at the hands of Scotland's Robert the Bruce. Yes, the very Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where England's massive army was crushed. But for the whispers, that battlefield failure was only the backdrop for the real drama, Edward's heart. From his youth, Edward formed a striking bond with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight who was everything a medieval courtier shouldn't be, mocking, flamboyant, and adored beyond reason by his king. Imagine Edward and Gaveston laughing in torchlit banquets, sharing inside jokes while barons glared daggers at them from across the hall. Gaveston was showered with gifts, titles, and lands, elevated far above his station, while the nobility fumed that the king's affection was making a mockery of their dignity. The odd detail: Gaveston was given titles with a touch of satire, such as the king's brother, a move so openly flaunting that it bordered on parody. You walk into the chambers of Westminster, where Edward and Gaveston lingered too long over wine goblets, their hands brushing, their closeness undeniable. Chronicles accused Gaveston of dressing in silk, strutting with arrogance, and even mocking powerful lords with nicknames. Was this love? Was it infatuation? Scholars still argue whether Edward's passion for Gaveston was romantic, sexual, or simply obsessive favoritism, but the rage it stirred was very real. You drift into the cold gray of 1312, when Gaveston was captured by jealous nobles. In the dark of Warwick Castle, Gaveston was executed without trial, a blade severing the link between Edward and his most beloved companion. You imagine Edward's grief, his heart hollowed, his eyes refusing sleep. The kingdom staggered under the weight of his mourning. But the story doesn't end there. Another man entered the king's orbit, Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston had been flamboyant, Despenser was calculating. His hold over Edward II grew suffocating, sparking rebellion across the realm. The king granted him lands and privileges, while nobles muttered of sin and scandal, of a love that bent politics into tyranny. You picture Edward and Despenser standing too close at court. The Queen, Isabella of France, watching from a distance, her face like carved stone. Here's the odd and chilling twist. Isabella herself later became known as the she-wolf of France, rebelling against her husband. She allied with Roger Mortimer, invaded England, and forced Edward II to abdicate. The whispers say this wasn't just politics, it was personal. Imagine a queen humiliated, watching her husband's affections lavished not on her, but on men who sneered at her authority. The whispers turn darker as you follow Edward to Berkeley Castle, where he was imprisoned after his forced abdication. His end is infamous, soaked in rumor and cruelty. Some chronicles claim he was murdered with a red-hot poker inserted into his body, a grotesque punishment designed to mock his alleged homosexual desires. Scholars still argue whether this story was propaganda, exaggerated by his enemies to smear his name forever. Yet the tale clings to him like smoke. You can almost smell the iron heating, hear the shuffle of boots in the night, feel the sting of rumor etched into eternity. And still, the human heart lingers. Imagine Edward in his cell, alone, remembering Gaveston's laughter, Despenser's embrace, wondering if love had cursed him or carried him. The whispers do not answer, they only hum with a kind of pity. The oddest part? Despite his scandalous reputation, Edward II may not have died at Berkeley at all. Some letters suggest he lived on in obscurity, smuggled to Italy, wandering as a monk. Was this wishful thinking, a sympathetic attempt to rewrite a grim ending? Scholars still argue, yet the possibility flickers faintly, like the last candle in a damp chamber. You step back, and Edward II's shadow clings to you like smoke. Part tragedy, part scandal, part tender humanity. He was a king undone not only by war and rebellion, but by the sheer force of love, in a time when love itself could be branded as treason. The torchlight shifts, and suddenly you're walking under a stone arch dripping with moss, the whispers guiding you to another royal hall. The banners here shimmer with red lions and golden fleur-de-lis, but the air feels different. Less scandal, more polished performance. The whispers curl around the name of James I of England, the Scottish king who carried his crown south after Elizabeth I's death, and with it, the beginning of the Stuart dynasty in England. Mainstream history says James I was a learned man, a lover of books, and a king who commissioned the King James Bible, the very text that shaped English-speaking religion and literature for centuries. But the gossip, tucked between those sermons and translations, was far juicier. His passionate attachments to young men at court. You picture James lounging in a high-backed chair, velvet robes pooling at his feet, his hand resting just a little too long on the arm of a handsome favorite. From the start of his reign, James filled his inner circle with men he adored, granting them titles and lands, showering them with intimacy disguised as royal favor. One of his earliest loves was Robert Carr, a dashing figure who caught the king's eye in a jousting accident. Yes, imagine that. Carr, thrown from his horse, injured, and James rushing forward almost too eagerly to cradle him. That odd detail that their romance began in blood and broken bones feels almost like the opening of a medieval ballad. But Carr wasn't James's greatest passion. That title belonged to George Villiers, later the Duke of Buckingham. Tall, striking, and utterly magnetic, Villiers became the king's shadow, his constant companion. Letters between James and Villiers drip with tenderness, James calling him his sweet child and wife, phrases that don't exactly scream platonic friendship. Scholars still argue whether their relationship was sexual or simply one of intense affection, but the evidence feels heavy with longing. Picture James and Villiers sitting by the hearth late into the night, the court asleep, the two of them whispering dreams of power and eternity. Villiers, ambitious and cunning, knew how to make his beauty a weapon. James, tired and aging, leaned on him not only for affection, but for strength in a kingdom uneasy with a Scottish king on England's throne. The oddest part? James's wife, Anne of Denmark, seems to have tolerated it. Maybe she understood her husband's needs. Maybe she found comfort in her own spheres of influence. Or maybe she simply couldn't fight the pull Villiers had. In any case, the triangle remained oddly stable, though rumors flew through London's taverns faster than spilled ale. You wander through the echo of Parliament chambers, where lords muttered their disapproval. They saw Villiers climb to power at terrifying speed, becoming master of the royal bedchamber, then Lord Admiral, then nearly untouchable. They sneered that the king's affection was clouding judgment. Satirical poems of the time mocked the intimacy between them, some so explicit they'd raise modern eyebrows. And yet, James didn't hide it well. In one famous moment, he openly declared in front of Parliament that he loved Villiers more than anyone, comparing their bond to that of Christ and his disciples. You can feel the nobles' jaws clench, their knuckles whitening around their quills. The whispers lead you further, into the twilight of James's life. As the king aged, his body weakened, but Villiers never strayed far. Some accounts describe them kissing openly, while others insist this was political slander. Either way, the image lingers, an aging king clinging to his radiant favorite, the lines between love and governance tangled beyond repair. Scholars still argue whether James's love for Villiers doomed his political credibility, or whether it was simply one facet of a reign already marred by debt and tension with Parliament. But to the Whispers, the romance mattered more than policy. It was a human story, pulsing beneath the crown. You catch an odd little footnote. James was rumored to be so affectionate that he once stroked Villiers' face in public during a formal audience, leaving courtiers stiff with discomfort. The kind of detail, it says more about intimacy than any archive of royal decrees. And so James I remains a paradox. The man who shaped the English Bible, who united crowns, who set the stage for the Stuart saga, was also a king who wrote tender love letters to men and let his heart guide his hand in government. His reign wasn't remembered as scandalous in the fiery sense of Edward II's, but the Whispers insist it was just as revealing, just as intimate. You step back from the throne room of James, the scent of parchment and candle wax fading, his voice lingering in the echo. I am your king, but I am also your lover. Whether history wants to hear it or not, the Whispers keep repeating it. The path tilts again, and you drift into a long corridor, hung with tapestries of hunting scenes, antlers casting shadows on the walls. You can almost hear the crack of muskets and the distant bark of hounds. The whispers swirl, dropping another name into your ear. Charles I, son of James, the king who would eventually lose his head. History remembers him for civil war, for his stubborn clash with Parliament, for the bloody execution in Whitehall. But the Whispers are after something else. Mainstream accounts paint Charles as devoted to his French wife, Henrietta Maria. Their marriage was passionate, producing many children, and in portraits, you see them gazing at each other with a softness rare in arranged unions. Yet tucked between those family portraits and endless war proclamations are rumors that Charles inherited more than just a crown from his father. He may also have inherited James's fondness for men. At first glance, it seems impossible. Charles had the reputation of being more restrained, more private, almost puritanical in his manners. But the Whispers insist that under that polished veneer, he formed bonds with certain male courtiers that went beyond politics. One name surfaces again and again: George Villiers, the same Duke of Buckingham who had bewitched his father. Now picture it, young Charles shy and serious, watching his father's favorite strut through court, polished and radiant. Villiers, already middle-aged but still magnetic, wrapped the prince in his web of charm. Letters from the time hint at closeness, words of affection, notes that sound warmer than mere diplomacy. Some scholars still argue whether Villiers shifted his affection from James to Charles, keeping power through intimacy. Others dismiss it as coincidence, claiming Villiers was simply good at flattering anyone near the throne. But the whispers paint a juicier picture. Imagine the awkwardness of a triangle where father and son both adored the same man. If it were a play, you'd expect too much drama to be real. Yet contemporary gossip teased at the idea, hinting that Villiers held sway over both generations of kings, with something far stronger than politics. The oddest little detail: when Villiers was assassinated in 1628, Charles wept openly, collapsing in grief. Courtiers wrote about his inconsolable mourning, a display far more intense than the formal sorrow expected of a monarch. He even wore black longer than etiquette demanded, clinging to the memory of a man his father had once adored. You walk further, and the whispers bring another dimension. Charles was a collector, obsessed with art. He built one of the most magnificent collections of Renaissance masterpieces England had ever seen, filled with canvases of muscular saints, idealized male forms, and heroic nudes. Scholars still argue whether this reflected genuine artistic taste or a subtler personal resonance. Maybe both. After all, in candlelight, staring at Titian's mythological gods or Caravaggio's sultry figures, who knows what desire stirred in his mind? And yet, Charles lived in an age where discretion was survival. Unlike his father, he didn't openly declare love for male favorites. He locked his secrets behind tapestries, letting the world see only the devoted husband, the stern ruler. That doesn't stop the whispers, though. They slip through the cracks of history, like candle smoke. Even Parliament suspected too much intimacy in Charles's bonds with his chosen companions. Pamphlets of the time mocked him, sneering at his reliance on Villiers, accusing him of being led by affection rather than reason. It's easy to dismiss this as propaganda. Civil war brewing tends to paint kings in the darkest colors. But the persistence of the accusations feels telling. There's a quirky moment you can't ignore. Charles was once caught exchanging private gifts with a male companion during a royal hunt, a gesture that felt more like a lover's token than a political favor. The details are vague, lost in rumor, but the story fits too neatly with the pattern his family carried. The tragedy, of course, is that Charles's story ends not in whispered scandal, but in public spectacle. The image of him stepping onto the scaffold, cloak fluttering, declaring himself the King of England, is etched into every schoolbook. But as you stand here in this hushed hall, the whispers insist that what mattered just as much were the private glances, the carefully chosen words, the secret griefs that no axe could cut away. So Charles becomes another paradox, a man both dutiful husband and secret mourner, a king both stiff with piety and quietly stirred by desires his kingdom would never openly acknowledge. His reign is remembered for blood and division, yet the whispers soften it, reminding you that even in civil war, the heart seeks its own alliances. You step away from the tapestries, the scent of horse leather and wet earth fading, carrying with you the image of a king who wept for Villiers, who filled his halls with paintings of beautiful men, who may have kept his heart's secrets locked tighter than his crown jewels. The corridor narrows, and you find yourself in the shadowed wings of St. James's Palace, where the hush is broken only by the distant clatter of armor and the soft shuffle of slippers on polished stone. The whispers now speak of James II, the last Catholic monarch of England, whose reign was brief, turbulent, and cloaked in secrecy that went beyond religion. James II is remembered primarily for his attempts to restore Catholicism, triggering the Glorious Revolution and his eventual flight to France. But beyond the political upheaval, the whispers trace his heart, hinting at attachments that were rarely spoken of. Mainstream history mentions his mistresses and court intrigues, but the secret undercurrent was his intense favoring of certain men at court, men whose influence over him raised eyebrows in ways that scandal sheets dared not print. You imagine him in his private apartments, candlelight flickering against tapestries depicting saints and battles, leaning close to a young courtier with a velvet sleeve, exchanging jokes and confidences that no other could share. Odd detail. One contemporary diary records that James rewarded his male favorites with gold coins hidden in tiny pouches, gifts that were as symbolic as they were material, each coin a token of intimacy as much as power. Scholars still argue whether these gestures were purely affectionate or carried romantic intent, but the pattern of lavish attention is undeniable. The whispers grow louder when you hear of Arabella Churchill, his sister-in-law, maneuvering in court, aware of James's closeness to certain male companions, yet unable or unwilling to intervene. Picture the tension in candlelit corridors, the clash of ambition and desire, playing out behind heavy doors. James's affection for these men wasn't as flamboyant as James I's, nor as tragic as Edward II, but it had consequences, influencing decisions and shaping the court's hierarchy in subtle, quiet ways. Another quirky detail: James reportedly took one favorite with him on hunting trips, not just as a companion, but as an advisor, who whispered in his ear about the strategy of men and beasts alike, blurring the lines between affection and counsel. These trips became a stage for private bonding, away from prying eyes and the judgmental gaze of court. Scholars still debate whether James's affection influenced his political choices more than the personal morality of his subjects did. Yet the whispers insist it left its mark. You walk down the spiral staircase, imagining James's private chambers at Whitehall, the flicker of torchlight illuminating his worn hands as they reached for letters filled with the delicate flourishes of an intimate correspondence. The letters, if they exist, were long destroyed or hidden away, yet the rumors persist, echoing across the centuries, hinting at a man whose personal life was as carefully managed as the kingdom he ruled. Oddly, despite the danger of political fallout, James's openness with a select few companions seemed to deepen his confidence, even as Parliament and the public grew increasingly wary. Picture whispered conversations in hushed corners, promises exchanged under candlelight, the quiet comfort of human connection amidst a kingdom teetering on the edge of revolution. As you linger in these halls, you realize that James II, though exiled and vilified in mainstream narratives, carried forward a pattern seen through the lineage of English kings: the blending of power, affection, and the defiance of societal norms. His heart, much like Edward II's or James I's, moved along paths that history often tried to erase, leaving only whispers for those willing to listen. In the chill of these corridors, you feel the weight of secrecy, the tension of unspoken love, and the paradox of a king forced to navigate desire in tandem with duty. The whispering fades, leaving only the echo of a crown too heavy for the heart it encases. The hallway opens into a sunlit gallery, tapestries backlit by morning light streaming through tall, mullioned windows. The whispers shift again, this time naming George IV, a king of excess, elegance, and hidden longings that most historians tiptoe around, known to many as the Prince Regent before his coronation. George IV's flamboyant lifestyle and insatiable taste for luxury make him an unforgettable figure. But behind the powdered wigs and gilded carriages lies a story of private desires, carefully veiled from public scrutiny. Mainstream history chronicles George's indulgences, lavish parties, extravagant architecture, and scandalous debts. Yet the whispers tell you that among the silk, champagne, and ballroom dances, he formed intimate attachments to men, some of whom became influential companions in ways that subtly shaped court life. You picture George reclining on a chaise in his Regency apartments, peacock feather fan in hand, eyes twinkling as a young companion reads poetry aloud. Scholars still argue whether George's attentions were primarily aesthetic or romantic, but the lines blur in the sumptuous haze of Regency London. Oddly, George had an obsession with theatricality, using performance not just in public, but in private as a means of expressing affection. He staged elaborate masquerades where only his closest companions could participate, allowing him to explore desire under the guise of play acting. These scenes were whispered about in servants' quarters, but no record dared reach print in polite society. Imagine the colors: emerald greens, ruby reds, gilded masks, the faint scent of lavender and candle wax, mingling with hushed laughter. George IV's relationships with men weren't just private comforts. They carried influence. Courtiers knew that gaining the king's favor meant more than politicking. It meant charm, wit, and the subtle navigation of his personal affections. Some companions reportedly received gifts of jewelry or prestigious posts, a testament to the king's dual powers of generosity and desire. Scholars still debate whether these appointments were purely merit-based or guided by the king's private inclinations. Yet the whispers suggest that intimacy often intertwined with politics. You wander along the gallery, noting portraits of George with his queen, Caroline of Brunswick, their forced smiles masking tension. The queen herself was aware, to some extent, of her husband's secret bonds. Yet her attempts to influence him met with royal detachment or dramatic countermoves, adding another layer to the intrigue. Imagine her silently observing from a balcony while George exchanges a conspiratorial glance with a favored companion across the room. Power, affection, and societal performance all intertwined. A quirky little detail surfaces. George reportedly composed private verses for some of his male companions, elaborate rhymes praising wit, beauty, or loyalty, which he kept hidden in ornate boxes. Scholars still argue whether these were innocent expressions of admiration or clear markers of romantic attachment. But the intimacy of poetry, so tender, so deliberate, suggests the heart was at work beyond the public eye. Even in public, George's manner hinted at his predilections. In portraits, his poses often exaggerated the elegance of male companions standing near him. The subtle placement of a hand, a tilt of the head, or the luminous way candlelight highlighted features of those he favored. It's as if every brushstroke whispered secrets meant for those who could read between the lines. And yet, despite the whispers, George IV reigned in an era of burgeoning prudery. The social risks of exposure were immense, yet he navigated them with flair, blending public performance, private affection, and political maneuvering. The tension between desire and duty, intimacy and image, pulsed in every gilded corridor, in every velvet-draped chamber. You leave the gallery, sunlight fading behind you, carrying the impression of a king who indulged his heart with subtle defiance, who orchestrated life as a stage, and whose hidden passions left only faint, yet enduring, echoes for the whispers of history to uncover. You move into a dimly lit antechamber, the scent of beeswax and aged wood wrapping around you as the whispers focus on William IV, George IV's younger brother, a monarch often overshadowed by flamboyance, but whose personal life holds its own secrets. Known as the Sailor King for his naval career, William's reign was comparatively short and understated, but the whispers insist that his heart, like his predecessors, harbored attachments beyond those acknowledged publicly. Mainstream history praises William for political moderation and the Reform Act of 1832, yet rarely delves into the intimate connections that shaped his days in the palace. Imagine William aboard a ship in his youth, the wind tugging at his coat, confiding in a trusted mate while the sea churns around them. Oddly, sailors often noted the unusual closeness between the young prince and certain shipmates. Letters hint at gifts, shared laughter, and secret camaraderie that historians still debate. Mentorship, friendship, or something more. Scholars argue whether these relationships influenced his later courtly attachments, but the pattern of intimacy echoes across generations. Back on land, William's male companions continued to hold his favor. Court whispers describe him attending dinners and private evenings with select gentlemen, conversations extending long after candles burned low. Scholars still argue whether these meetings were socially strategic or personally affectionate, but the notes of loyalty and attention suggest more than mere politicking. Imagine William seated, legs crossed, a favored companion across from him, both sharing an amused glance while courtiers watch, oblivious to the quiet undercurrents. A quirky detail. William had a penchant for collecting marine artifacts, shells, navigational instruments, miniature ship models, which he gifted to select male companions. The symbolism isn't lost. Tokens of a shared passion, reminders of adventures at sea, miniature worlds for private amusement. Scholars still debate whether these were innocent hobbies or coded gestures of attachment, yet they create a vivid picture of personal life intersecting with professional identity. Even in public, William's eyes sometimes lingered longer than decorum allowed, a fleeting glance at a gentleman whose presence brought ease to the otherwise formal court. Imagine him at a royal banquet, the sounds of clinking silver fading into a hush of private awareness, a subtle smile acknowledging loyalty, wit, or charm. These understated gestures became his language of discretion, a necessary navigation of desire within the rigid expectations of monarchy. Oddly, his relationships seem to shape decisions in small but telling ways. Historians note that certain posts and honors were granted to loyal favorites, though William's pragmatism ensured politics remained intact. The whispers suggest that affection and governance intertwined, a quiet but potent influence behind his measured reign. Scholars still argue whether personal bonds ever outweighed duty, yet the subtle patterns persist in surviving letters and court reports. In the final light of this antechamber, you sense William IV as both sailor and sovereign, a man who balanced affection, discretion, and duty. His heart, less flamboyant than George IV's, left traces nonetheless, a network of quiet loyalties, tender gestures, and private confidences. The whispers fade as you exit, leaving the echo of a king who navigated his desires as deftly as he once commanded ships, a man whose hidden attachments added texture to the public narrative of his reign. The heavy oak doors creak as you enter a candlelit drawing room, shadows dancing across gilded panels, and the whispers now focus on Edward VII, the son of Queen Victoria, a king known for charm, sophistication, and secret longings that defied the rigid morality of his mother's era. Edward's reign, though brief, was marked by the social and political transformations of early 20th century Britain. Yet the whispers insist that behind the tailored suits and opulent balls lay a network of discreet relationships with men that history rarely acknowledges. Mainstream history celebrates Edward for modernizing the monarchy and navigating international diplomacy, but you can almost hear the soft murmurs of servants and courtiers aware of the private connections he nurtured. Imagine him reclining in a velvet chair in Marlborough House, a favored companion seated nearby, sharing laughter, confidences, and subtle gestures unnoticed by the public eye. Oddly, Edward was known to host evenings where he'd engage in playful role-playing games with his close male friends, creating a private theater of intimacy away from the watchful eyes of London society. Scholars still argue whether these activities were purely social or carried romantic undertones, but the presence of repeated companionship suggests more than mere amusement. You wander past portraits of Edward in ceremonial garb, noting the sparkling eyes that hint at a mischievous mind behind the formal pose. Gifts exchanged between him and favored men, a silver pocket watch, an embroidered handkerchief, a personalized walking cane, become tokens of connection, their significance hidden beneath layers of etiquette. Scholars still debate whether these gestures were coded declarations of affection or refined friendship. Yet the frequency and intimacy of such gifts cannot be ignored. One quirky detail surfaces. Edward reportedly enjoyed writing playful, witty letters to his male companions, filled with inside jokes, affectionate teases, and carefully crafted compliments. The tone is light, teasing, yet intimate, a dance of words meant for private eyes. Scholars argue whether these letters should be read as casual camaraderie or evidence of romantic sentiment, yet they undeniably reveal a dimension of the king's personal life obscured by protocol and propriety. Even in public, Edward's interactions sometimes betrayed subtle preferences, the positioning of companions at formal events, the lingering handshake, the shared glance, all small, almost imperceptible cues that those attuned could read. You picture the grand ballrooms, the chatter of aristocrats, and Edward's private signal, a fleeting touch, a raised brow, communicating familiarity and trust to select men, while maintaining the facade demanded by duty. Oddly, these relationships occasionally influenced political or social favors, though discreetly. Certain courtiers or allies enjoyed small benefits, promotions, or patronage tied more to personal rapport than official duty. Scholars still argue whether personal preference ever swayed governance, but the pattern reflects a long-standing royal tradition, affection intertwined with influence, subtle yet powerful. As the flickering candlelight fades, you sense Edward VII as both monarch and man, his charm extending beyond political acumen into private networks of affection. The whispers linger, painting a portrait of intimacy concealed beneath layers of etiquette, a heart navigating the tensions of desire, duty, and discretion. In this quiet room, you feel the rhythm of concealed attachment, a continuation of the hidden lineage of love, threading through England's monarchy. You step into a grand yet shadowed corridor, tapestries brushing your fingertips, the air thick with candle smoke, as the whispers turn to George VI, a king whose stoicism and sense of duty often overshadowed personal life, yet whose hidden affections are slowly emerging from the margins of historical whispers. Known as the Reluctant King, George VI ascended unexpectedly after the abdication of his brother Edward VIII, and while his public image emphasizes steadfastness during wartime, the quieter corridors of Buckingham Palace hint at private relationships with men that were never meant for public knowledge. Mainstream history emphasizes George VI's leadership during World War II, his speeches, and his efforts to bolster national morale. But the whispers suggest that behind the composed exterior, moments of private intimacy shaped his emotional life. Imagine him in a private sitting room, the soft rustle of curtains, speaking quietly with a trusted male aide or confidant, sharing a smile, a subtle joke, or a shared frustration about court protocols. Oddly, personal diaries and letters hinted affection, expressed through careful attention, small gifts, or quiet companionship, rather than overt displays. Scholars still argue whether these gestures crossed the threshold into romance or remained deep platonic bonds shaped by trust and discretion. You wander past portraits of George VI, noting the slightly tense jawline and attentive eyes, suggesting someone attuned to details, someone who valued loyalty and companionship in ways the public could never see. One quirky detail: he reportedly enjoyed giving personalized tokens, engraved watches, silver cufflinks, or small handcrafted objects to male confidants, gestures that communicated appreciation, admiration, and, perhaps, more intimate affection. Scholars debate the interpretation, but the pattern suggests a private life richer than official biographies allow. Even during official ceremonies, the careful placement of aides and attendants around the king can be read as more than protocol. Imagine George subtly favoring the proximity of certain individuals. A shared glance that lasts a heartbeat too long. A gentle touch on the arm. Small signals of trust and intimacy hidden within the choreography of public life. These gestures were imperceptible to most, but the palace walls remember. Oddly, George VI's own insecurities and the immense weight of the crown may have deepened these private bonds, creating a network of emotional support among trusted men. Scholars still argue whether his attachments influenced decision-making or remained strictly personal, yet the intimacy provided relief from a life dominated by expectation and duty. The tension between public service and private longing threads through each whispered anecdote, highlighting a humanity often erased from history. As you trace the echoes of footfalls along polished floors, you feel George VI not just as a monarch burdened with responsibility, but as a man seeking connection and affection in a world that permitted little. The whispers fade into the hush of the corridors, leaving you with an image of discreet devotion, quiet loyalty, and the persistent undercurrent of love carefully navigated beneath the glare of public life. The final chamber you enter is bathed in soft twilight, the glow of fading candles reflecting off gilded mirrors, and the whispers turn to modern times, to the reigning monarchs whose personal lives, while still discreet, offer glimpses into the ongoing tradition of private affections in the royal lineage. The focus now is on Edward VIII, again, whose abdication forever tied his name to both scandal and desire. Here, in the hush of this palace room, the shadows reveal the depth of his private connections with men, relationships shaped by both passion and the societal pressures of the early 20th century. Mainstream history immortalizes Edward VIII for abdicating the throne to Mary Wallace Simpson. Yet, whispers hint that his emotional world extended beyond this famed romance. Imagine Edward seated in a secluded drawing room, a close male companion by his side, the air thick with unspoken understanding and quiet laughter. Oddly, servants noted that his moods brightened in the presence of certain men, their interactions subtle but intense, communicated through shared jokes, private gestures, and letters never meant to be seen by the public. Scholars still argue whether these relationships were purely affectionate or romantically charged, but the consistency and intimacy cannot be ignored. You wander along portraits and photographs of Edward, noting the playful glint in his eyes and the carefully constructed posture that masks the intensity of his private life. Gifts exchanged, embroidered handkerchiefs, bespoke cufflinks, or even small sculptures served as silent tokens of trust and devotion, reminders of a connection concealed beneath layers of etiquette. Scholars debate the interpretation of these artifacts, yet their recurrence across his life suggests intentional, meaningful exchange. Even public appearances sometimes revealed fleeting signals, a lingering glance, a subtle adjustment of attire for a favored companion, or the positioning of trusted aides near him in social gatherings. These almost imperceptible cues created a hidden narrative that only those attuned could perceive, a language of discreet attachment written in gestures rather than words. Oddly, Edward's charm and social finesse allowed him to maintain these relationships without attracting the scrutiny that would have devastated a predecessor in earlier centuries. The influence of these private attachments sometimes extended into politics and social favor, though discreetly. Certain companions gained access to privileges or positions subtly shaped by Edward's personal affection, yet he maintained an appearance of impartiality and decorum. Scholars still argue whether personal preference ever unduly influenced public decisions. But the intertwining of intimacy and authority remains a consistent theme across generations. As the candlelight dims and shadows stretch long across the chamber, you feel the weight of centuries of hidden royal affections. From George IV to Edward VIII, from whispered poetry to subtle gestures, threading through England's monarchy. These kings, despite power and pomp, shared a common need: connection, companionship, and love hidden beneath layers of expectation. The echoes of their private hearts linger in the hushed corridors, a legacy that whispers the complexity of human desire against the rigid backdrop of royal duty. The soft glow of twilight settles over the palace corridors, and you finally lean back, letting the stories of hidden affections and secret gestures wash over you. The echoes of George IV's extravagance, William IV's quiet loyalties, Edward VII's playful confidences, George VI's discreet support networks, and Edward VIII's clandestine connections all blend into a tapestry of intimacy, carefully hidden behind velvet curtains and gilded walls. You imagine the faint scent of beeswax, the rustle of silk, and the whisper of footsteps. Every detail a reminder that even kings, with their crowns and ceremonies, sought the same warmth and trust that ordinary hearts crave. In this gentle wind-down, the frenetic pulse of courtly intrigue slows. Picture a candle flickering on a carved oak table, the glow illuminating a handheld token, a letter, or a silver cufflink. Small artifacts of loyalty and love, each carrying a private story no history book fully captures. Scholars may debate the nature of these relationships, questioning motives and meanings, but what remains undeniable is the humanity behind the titles. You can almost hear the quiet laughter in hidden rooms, the soft conversations that never reach the ears of the public, the subtle touches and shared confidences that formed an invisible lifeline through the pressures of monarchy. You feel the centuries compress into a single thread, connecting these kings, their hearts navigating affection and duty, secrecy and desire. The ornate rooms, the gleaming portraits, the whispered rumors, all fade gently into memory as you allow yourself to simply imagine their world. The candlelight dims further, shadows curling into corners, and you can sense a hush over the palace, a pause in the relentless formality of royal life. It's a reminder that behind power and pageantry, there were men seeking connection, love, and understanding. As your breathing slows and the world outside softens, let the whispers of these hidden lives settle in your mind like a soft lullaby. Their stories, their hidden hearts, are yours to carry gently, a reminder that even in the grandeur of history, intimacy and longing quietly endure. Feel the hush, the weight of secrecy, the comfort of knowing that desire has always been part of the human story. End of script. Sweet dreams.